Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Parenting Through the Parsha with Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
One of the many things that I did not necessarily think about before becoming a parent that only became clear afterwards and then needing to figure out as I go is what it's like and how to navigate being a parent when going through a challenging moment or a tough time. It's hard enough in life to move through a moment that feels fraught or painful or challenging. And then layering on top of that, how to parent during that time is that much more difficult. It's hard because, well, hard things are hard. But then it's also difficult to know that I'm essentially being watched, not in the form of surveillance or anything like that, but because little eyes are always watching and little ears are always listening, both in terms of essentially needing to be on a version of good behavior. I'm not going to speak the way I would speak or act the way I would act in front of my kids that I might in front of a friend. But also, and probably more importantly than that, because there's always a sense that I'm hoping my kids are looking to me for how they might act in the world. What it is to be a human in the world is a big part of what we are both explicitly and implicitly teaching our kids. And that's then important to teach them as I'm going through a hard time. And it's that much more important for me to make sure I'm hopefully showing up in a meaningful and healthy way for them and with them when things are feeling fraught. This is a tough Parsha. There are some painful moments in Parshat Chukat. Miriam passes away in this Parsha. Aaron passes away in this Parsha. This is also the Parsha in which Moses strikes the rock twice to get water out of the rock, for which he is told that the consequence or punishment for that is not going into the land of Israel with the people. But these aren't, of course, separate incidents. There's a way of thinking about all of them or some of them as being connected with one another. And it's interesting to note that shortly before we hear about Moses striking the rock, we find out that Miriam dies. And in looking at that narrative specifically, the Talmud mentions that Miriam's well, we're told that Miriam has a well that follows the people as they move through the desert, and the rabbis talk about, well, part of the reason that the people need water is because the well that Miriam had that followed the people through the desert was no longer there. So the Talmud talks about how Miriam's well was one of the things that sustained the people as they were on their journey from Egypt. And interestingly, in his commentary on that thought, Rashi says it wasn't a well, it was actually a rock that rolled alongside the people as they wandered through the desert, which is an interesting image to have. And Rashi adds that this is then the same rock that Moses hit. And after Miriam died, Moses had no desire to get water from that rock since she had died. I had never read this before. This is a really interesting and nuanced thought. It's not only that Miriam's death was a primary factor in how Moses responded, but Moses is told by God to get water out of the rock. Moses is grieving. Moses is upset. And there's a part of Moses that doesn't want to do that. And so instead of doing that in the optimal way, he essentially acts out. His emotions, his grief get the better of him in that moment in front of the people that he is responsible for. And so then there are consequences for that. He is then seen as no longer fit to lead the people. But I'll just point out that this isn't in a vacuum. It's been a long schlep through the desert already. People are complaining. There's any number of difficult moments. This is essentially the straw that breaks the camel's back. And the symbolism there is really interesting, that it's not just, well, Miriam has a well and the well dried up and then Moses hits the rock. It's that per Rashi's comment, it's the very same thing. And when Moses is told this is the place from which sustenance can come for the people and should come for the people, it's just too much for him and he can't take it. It's too much. And he acts out, and there's a consequence for how he acts out. And it's a harsh punishment. I'm certainly not saying that when any one of us as a parent or as a human has a moment of weakness that we're not fit to be parents, that would make parenting quite the high wire act, if not to say impossible. But the insight of the narrative is interesting, that when we're having a hard time, when there's a tough moment, sometimes that can come out in other ways. And if I'm being honest with myself, yeah, if I've had a tough day at work, or if I'm going through something challenging, that might mean I'm less patient with my kids that evening. Or that might mean that I'm not at my best in front of my kids. And that's not okay. Right? Even if it's nothing drastic or extreme, it's still not okay. And so we have an obligation to take care of ourselves as individuals, as people, not just so that we can go be good parents, but to take care of ourselves first. And that includes our emotional lives, our spiritual lives, so that we can also then show up for our kids in the way that we need to. We need to take care of ourselves so we can move through things with integrity and as much equanimity as possible. And also for them, so we can show up for them in the ways that we want to. And so we can teach them explicitly and implicitly how to move through a tough moment, how to get through a tough time. And it's simultaneously, of course, both important to have appropriate measures of compassion for ourselves in the moments when we fall short of this ideal, and also to push ourselves to be better at this as much as we can, to take care of ourselves so that we are individually okay as people, and to be the best versions of parents that we can be, so that we can feel good about the way in which we are modeling for our kids, and so that our kids can learn from us, and so that we can collectively grow together as we each go about our respective journeys.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.